Salut, le Wargamer.
Et oui les amis, on est en direct de la maison de Sir Ian Livingstone, le fondateur de Game Workshop, à l'occasion de la sortie en français du livre The Dice Man, édité par Arkham Asylum, que je remercie au début de cette vidéo pour l'organisation aussi de cette interview. Pour cette petite interview, ce qui se passe, c'est que je vais poser les questions en français. Elles seront posées hors caméra à Sir Ian Livingstone directement en anglais. Et je commence par un petit témoignage, puisque Sir Ian Livingstone, je tenais à commencer cette interview par vous remercier pour votre temps aujourd'hui, mais aussi pour vous témoigner, en mon nom et celle de la communauté française, notre gratitude pour avoir écouté cette petite voix, celle qui vous a poussé, il y a pas loin de 50 ans, à quitter la facilité d'une vie active conventionnelle par celle de l'écoute de sa passion et de l'entrepreneuriat. Donc la première question, c'est fermez les yeux. Vous êtes en 1976 et tout est à faire. Comment avez-vous senti le poids du choix de l'entrepreneuriat pour vos proches?
Well, it was difficult in 1970s. There was the economic stagnation. To have a good professional job was really important and obviously beneficial to me. And my father and my mother were very traditional in their way. They come from a very humble background themselves. And when I said to them, hey, I'm going to pack in my job and do Games Workshop, they could not believe it. But to their great credit, they said, okay, follow your hearts, that's fine.
Pour la deuxième question, il faut savoir que Game Workshop était au début distributeur de Donjons et Dragons pour l'Europe et vous étiez un joueur de JDR. Quel est votre meilleur souvenir justement sur cette activité-là?
As you know, and you can see here, I'm surrounded by games. Games in my life. I enjoy everything about games, the social interaction, the fun, the camaraderie, and the joy of playing and sometimes, you know, doing bad deals with people, and it's that interaction of social interaction which is so much fun. But when I first played Dungeons & Dragons in 1975, I mean, that was a total games changer. It was a milestone in gaming history. Here was a game where you took on the role of heroes and wizards and clerics and go these fantastic journeys of the mind. And the box itself didn't look very much, the rule books didn't look very much, but it opened up your imagination like no game had ever done before. And I don't think any game ever will again. To have that theatre on the fly, going on these fantastic journeys of the mind, killing monsters and finding treasure, all in the comfort of your own living room, was an amazing experience. And so the stories that were created out of that situation were amazing. So it had a kind of deep-rooted impact on me as a games player, and also thinking about, you know what, this could be something special one day, and it did become special. Well, of course, we played Dungeons & Dragons obsessively in the early days, and I had a special character. Mine was Anvar the Barbarian. Steve Jackson's had a character called Crew, and of course when I was playing Dungeon Master I killed off Crew very quickly. Then Steve had Son of Crew, who lived a lot longer than his father did, but we used to go on these incredible journeys together and, you know, killing monsters, and I still remember almost crying one day when my favourite character, you know, came to a very terrible end, and it's deep in my heart, his memory lives on.
D'accord, et après vous sortez de la distribution de Donjons et Dragons en 1979. Vous décrivez d'ailleurs ce JDR comme une révolution avec un moteur de jeu qui permet aux participants de laisser complètement libre cours à leur imagination, et vous créez en 1982 le Sorcier de la Montagne de Feu, qui lance la série de défis fantastiques en France qu'on connaît sous le nom de Livre dont on est le héros. Quel est votre titre préféré et pourquoi?
As a Dungeons & Dragons player of some 7 years, I'd created a lot of dungeons and a lot of monsters and a lot of situations to lure people to their doom, you know, try and get them to fail rather than succeed. I was also editor of White Dwarf magazine, and so my worlds were connected to dungeons. I read loads of science fiction books and huge comic reader, so my imagination was filled with these fantastic worlds. Steve Jackson and I decided, wouldn't it be great if somehow you could take the essence of Dungeons & Dragons or other role-playing games and replace the Dungeon Master in book format? But of course, you could only offer multiple choices of A, B or C to the reader, but still retain the kind of imagination explosion of encountering all these monsters and situations that seem perilous to the reader. So we distilled a role-playing scenario into book format. So it was branching narrative, but with a simple gamer system attached to it, because we still want to have that element of role-playing. So we created 3 attributes: skill, stamina and luck. So it's effectively analog hypertext where children and young adults would make decisions at the end of each paragraph, which would take them to the next paragraph, and our job was, of course, to make them fail. But it was creating these worlds that were immersive, but giving the reader just the thought that they were in control of their own adventures. So rather than being a passive experience as a normal book, this was an interactive experience where the reader became the hero, as you said, un livre dont vous êtes le héros. And they were hugely successful, but they had a lot of criticism at the beginning. Because they were a game book, they weren't treated as normal books. And so the press was all negative. The Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide about them saying, because you're interacting with ghouls and demons, you're going to get possessed by the devil. The local vicar to Penguin Books threatened to chain himself to the railings of their offices until their books were banned. There were petitions sent in. At the same time, teachers and some parents were beginning to understand that these were actually great for the reluctant readers, giving agency to the reader, really engaged young boys in particular to start reading, and their imaginations were fired up by the adventures that they thought they were actually on. Even though the expectation level of fighting fantasy in 1982 was very low by the publishers, Penguin Books, the reality is that the sales became amazing because of the playground chat, the word of mouth in the playgrounds as children discovered them and told their friends, and there's whole network across the country. The Société de la Montagne du Feu to write 2 more. So Steve wrote Citadel of Chaos and I wrote Forest of Doom, and then the whole phenomenon began, and then they started being sold to other countries. In France, Gallimard did an amazing job, and today they've sold over 20 million copies worldwide. But it's that engagement with that role-playing element in fighting fantasy, with the game system and the interactive branching narrative that is so compelling. Hey Dad, what's sarcophagus? You know, they want yeah, they were curious about the language and the meaning, and improved critical thinking, algorithmic thinking, inspired creativity. There were an awful lot of things. The puzzle solving and problem solving. People saw the books then later as a contextual hub for learning.
And what is your favorite of the line?
Well, that's like asking what's my favorite child, and I got 4. So
we all have a favorite child.
nah, not in public we don't.
So yeah, not written by you if it's easier.
No, that's worse. I'd have to say my 4, and you can choose.
Top 4, yeah.
I'll give you my top 4, and you can choose which one. So obviously, Warlock Firetop Mountain, because emotional is the first one. And then Death Trap Dungeon, City of Thieves, and either Forest of Doom, Ian McCaig's incredible cover, and my new one, Shadow of the Giants, which everyone seems to like a lot. So it's kind of back to the high point of fighting fantasy. Well, I talk about that in Dice Men. If we hadn't have been running Games Workshop for those years, we'd have probably allowed Penguin Books to decide the covers. Because when we had that discussion about the covers, they said, oh, we'd like a certain type of cover. And what they were describing was like a toadstool with a little gnome sitting on the top and butterflies in the air. And we said, no. We want a book cover which threatens to rip the head off the reader. So we want to use some of our Games Workshop artists, because children are inspired. They're not frightened by these worlds. They know it's fantasy. It's not reality. And it gets them excited. It gets them drawn into being curious about what is so special about these books. And then they see the internal illustrations are equally amazing and atmospheric and wonderful, created fantasy worlds. And to Penguin's great credit, they said, okay, go ahead. So we used some of our Games Workshop artists. So Ian McCaig, Russ Nicholson, Martin McKenna, John Blanche, all featured in our early books.
Et est-ce que vous pensez que, un petit peu comme une technologie qui évoluerait pour s'améliorer, les livres dont vous êtes le héros, si on prend le premier ou même justement l'évolution sur les derniers, a pu aussi s'améliorer par rapport à l'immersion, la qualité, l'aspect parfois anxiogène sur certains choix?
I still do exactly the same as I did 45 years ago, where it was, yeah. The only difference is that I now use a computer to input the narrative. I used to write with pen and ink. I have all the original manuscripts in there. Some people say, do you use software? Do you use Twine or some branching narrative software? No, I don't. not at all. I don't think I could write in a different way myself. I mean, you hear about people using artificial intelligence, generative AI, to create interactive adventures, which might be good in the future. Who knows where AI is going to go? But I like to talk from my own imagination rather than using kind of aggregating millions of people's others' previous things. I like to try and be creative if I can.
En 1983, Game Workshop sort Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Quelle a été votre implication dans ce projet? Quel est votre premier souvenir lors du test du jeu? Et quelle était votre armée préférée et votre personnage favori?
Well, my involvement with Warhammer was really only in allowing it to happen, I guess, because Games Workshop was obviously, at first, was the distributor of Dungeons & Dragons for 3 years, at the end of which Gary Gygax, who granted us the license in the first place, came to the UK and said he wanted to merge the companies. His was TSR Hobbies, ours was Games Workshop. But it would have meant Steve and I spending half our life in Wisconsin and half our life in London. And so we said no to that merger opportunity, because we're also kind of independent young Brits, and we didn't want to be part of an American corporation. So we realized that suddenly our exclusivity with Dungeons & Dragons was over. Although we remained the biggest distributor, people still came to Games Workshop, even though we were no longer the exclusive distributor. So we realized how vulnerable you are if you don't own your own intellectual property. So we set about creating our own range of board games, starting off with 4 games, Apocalypse, what else we have, Doctor Who, Valley of the Four Winds and Warlock, and then we started publishing more games under license. But we knew in our hearts that we needed to replace D&D with a marquee game that would involve miniatures, because we had Citadel miniatures, had a role-playing element, and had the appeal to go to large audiences. So we were publishing games under license like RuneQuest and Traveller, and we were creating our own games as well. But it was Brian Ansell, who was managing director of Citadel Miniatures, that had the breakthrough idea to have this game which incorporated Citadel Miniatures, had a role-playing element, and had the ability to scale to a wide audience, and plus was played on a tabletop with lots of miniatures as opposed to a small group of miniatures, because that was the essence of Citadel, to sell lots of miniatures, of course. So it was he who had the idea of Warhammer, and he drafted in Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell to make it into a thing itself. And the original idea was actually to give it away as part of the mail orders, but as it gathered momentum, they realized that this could be an exciting project. And so they only printed like 3,000 copies, but it sold out really quickly. And Brian was also always into wanting to reinvest into something that's successful. Immediately had a reprint with much better production values, card figures, color components inside, and a much nicer box, and corrected all the errors that were in there, because it was full of errors, the original Warhammer. We were all very excited about it. Now, I can't profess to be a major Warhammer player myself. My favourite tribe at the time was Skaven.
Okay.
But I was more of a Dungeons and Dragons player. But my own history, of course, was tabletop wargaming. I used to have a Macedonian army with Cretan archers and phalanxes, and used to enjoy that. So to see mass combat battles using fancy miniatures was amazing, and so we really backed Brian. So we were more of a facilitator than a creator in Warhammer. I can't claim any design credit with Warhammer.
And during the rest of your life, are you still playing on board game and war game?
I don't play war games anymore. We play lots of board games. I've been running a group called the Games Night Club since 1986, and it's got the same members in it. Steve Jackson, of course, my business partner at Workshop and co-author Finding Fancy Game Books. Peter Molyneux, who's a pretty famous video games developer and designer. He did Fable, Populous, Black and White, and many other big games, and 2 people who are not in the industry. So I've published 624 issues of the Games Night newsletter to a circulation of 6, and we keep a record of every game played. At the end of the year, we get a cup, the Pagoda Cup that's up there to the winner. So it's kind of a joke club, but we really enjoy it. So we play once a week. It's a tradition with us to play board games. But role-playing games, it's just too much effort for
Yes.
our age. Yeah, but I love the miniatures. I mean, I've got lots and lots of
Yes.
miniatures I can show you later.
Et alors, par rapport à ça, quel a été votre sentiment dominant lorsque la compagnie a décidé de clôturer l'arc narratif et le jeu de Warhammer Fantasy Battle en 2015 pour laisser la place à Age of Sigmar?
Well, Steve Jackson and I left Games Workshop in 1991. We sold out to a management buyout, and of course they did incredible in terms of floated the company in 1993, full listing on the London Stock Exchange, and now it's a company worth £3 billion. So what they have achieved is amazing. But really it's just scaling up something which we started. The business model really hasn't changed that much. It's still selling company-owned products at retail, supported by its own magazine, its kind of vertical integration of creation to consumption, and it's very cash generative. So that business model requires things to happen. First of all, we saw with Workshop how they stopped selling other people's products. White Dwarf stopped featuring other people's games, and how they focus solely on their hit products, which was Citadel Miniatures, White Dwarf, and Warhammer 40k. Well, some people feel sorry that that happened. The result is Games Workshop is the most profitable, biggest hobby games company in the world today, arguably. And that's testament to what we started and also what the decisions that were being made by the current management. So Steve and I kind of watch as like proud parents, has seen our child grow up
Yes.
and become this amazing thing. And whilst we might not always agree with everything they've done, you can't help but say, yep, they've made the right decisions here. So they focused on one or two areas, which has proved to be the right decision. And I'm sure there's always an opportunity for them to license their IP to other companies who can keep those games alive. I know some of the board games are still published by third-party publishers like Talisman, so there's no reason why Sigma can't be published in a similar manner. So it's not like game over. There's still an opportunity out there.
En 1987, le premier Space Marine voit le jour. À ce moment-là, on comprend déjà que vous êtes partagé entre l'édition de livres dont vous êtes le héros et la société Game Workshop. Et donc, comment est-ce que vous avez suivi le développement des Space Marines? Et est-ce qu'à cette époque-là, vous aviez conscience qu'avec la création de cet univers, vous alliez inspirer, on va dire, les 40 prochaines années de la science-fiction?
My involvement was very little with Space Marines. I think I said Steve Jackson and I were running Games Workshop during the day and going home to our respective homes and writing Fighting Fantasy game books at night. And this was a tremendous pressure. It was like from 8 in the morning till 6, sometimes later doing workshop, and then from 8 till sometimes 2 in the morning writing Fighting Fantasy game books. And this had started in 1981 and been going on for 3 or 4 years, and we were absolutely exhausted. We had no social life. Girlfriends were complaining all the time, we can't go out or anything. And so something had to change. Being really successful international authors, going on world tours, going to, into Australia and New Zealand and Japan and the United States and France, of course, and everyone was wanting a piece of you. And trying to manage that was difficult. At least we were young, we were able to cope. So that's why we appointed a managing director to run the day-to-day business, and that person we chose was Brian Ansell. He was running Citadel Miniatures, he'd created Warhammer, it was in the middle of the UK, therefore for distribution of physical goods it was a good place to be geographically. So it made sense to move all of Games Workshop to the Midlands and appoint one person as the managing director for the whole group, and that was Brian. And Steve, of course, and I stayed on as non-executive directors effectively, but we weren't concerned with the day-to-day running of the company from 1986 onwards. Therefore, our involvement in Space Marines was very little other than to say, great, okay. This is a great idea and very, very exciting idea, and that's really how I can't again claim any creative ownership of other than to say, let's do it.
And what was your favorite army from this universe? About imagination?
What, the Space Marines?
Okay.
Yeah. I was very excited about it because I was a huge reader of science fiction, but I played fantasy. So Philip K. Dick, I've got hundreds of science fiction books that from Asimov and Herbert and all Zelazny and all these people. I used to read loads and loads. I used to read loads of science fiction comics as well. But I always liked playing fantasy games, and also, but I love science fiction films, not fantasy films. So something that had the appeal of both was very, very persuasive. So it was a very easy answer to say yes. And then when the artists took on, expressing it in a much more, brilliant way, and when the artists really got on board with Warhammer, it just, wow, amazing.
Et après ça, comment est-ce que vous avez réussi à jongler entre Game Workshop et l'édition de livres, puisque à ce moment-là, c'est-à-dire entre 1982 et 1986, c'est pas moins de 5,5 millions de livres dont vous êtes le héros qui avaient été vendus entre la France et l'Angleterre.
Yeah, those are amazing times. Just to suddenly find yourself being an international best-selling author, selling millions of copies both in the UK, France, and later in Japan, and all over the world was phenomenal. And going on international book tours was both exciting but also very tiring, and trying to run Games Workshop during the day and write new Final Fantasy game books in the evening became ever more and more demanding. So we realized that we can't do everything, even though you think you can, and you have to recognize your own strengths but also your own weaknesses and what you're good at and what you're not so good at. And we were very good at games, at building a new company, being young entrepreneurs, writing international successful game books and game design, but we weren't really the best people to be creating tabletop battle games because we didn't really have that expertise. So I think you realize to be a good entrepreneur, a good business person, you have to empower people who are good at what they're doing and do the jobs that you can't do or you shouldn't be doing. And really that's how Warhammer was able to grow at such speed, because it had our backing entirely, and then we put the capital behind it to make it happen. But then we left it to the experts to get on with it and make it the thing it became. When Brian Ansell first suggested Warhammer and then brought in Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell to make it the game it became, it was a natural process, and we brought more and more into that process. And of course, with 40K, wow, off it went.
En 1991, Game Workshop est vendu à l'initiative de Tom Kirby à un fonds d'investissement impliquant votre départ avec Steve Jackson. Comment avez-vous vécu l'émancipation de votre bébé?
Well, it was an exciting and sad moment at the same time. We've been running Games Workshops in 1975, and then we appointed Brian Ansell as managing director in 1986. And it was really, the decision to sell out entirely was really Brian's idea. Tom Kirby, who I'd hired originally from TSR to come work for Games Workshop, wanted a bigger role, wanted to take control, and he got private equity investment to back his management buyout proposition. So there were actually four of us who sold out at that time. It was both Brian Ansell, Keith Pinfold, the CFO, Steve Jackson, and myself. And it was a big decision. I think Steve and I were a lot more emotionally involved with the company than Brian and Keith in particular, because they hadn't started the company. So it was easier for them to sell out. From Steve and I think we wanted to keep a little bit of the company, but the private equity firm was saying, no, you all have to go, kind of thing. So we said, okay, we did. So we agreed to that buyout, and you should never look back. I've done lots of other things since, with Fighting Fantasy and video games and IDOS and Lara Croft and an awful lot of indie game success stories, and now I'm a partner in a venture capital fund. One thing about me is that I love this industry. I could retired decades ago, but the people in it are amazing. Their creativity is amazing. It's a very undervalued creative industry. I mean, it's at the forefront of entertainment to Generation Z. Interactive entertainment is how they conduct themselves in real life. They connect with everybody. They have prolific use of social media on their devices, and games speaks to Generation Z. So the games industry continues to grow, both analog and digital, and I always want to be a part of it. For the people in it, the opportunities, the excitement, the new ways of playing, the new ways of engaging with audiences is amazing. But so Games Workshop was a sad moment, but as I said earlier, we stand as proud parents watching this child get bigger and more amazing over time. And you just have to say, well done. I mean, different people have their different limits. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm very good at getting things started, having ideas, making stuff happen, don't mind adversity, happy to sleep in a van for 3 months, and happy to live on nothing, because if you're driven by passion, nothing can stop you. But when it gets into a serious business and all the processes you have to have and accountability and governance, and there's less exciting stuff, managing at scale is very demanding, and the process that you have to put in place. Yeah, I enjoy the fun factor, not necessarily trying to create a new global corporate entity. So I think you know in your own heart when you have to hand over the keys to somebody else to take it to the next stage. Some people don't like what I do, but they like scaling companies. They see that an incredible challenge, and they get in the right process people to make that happen. But I've always been a person who likes the excitement of a startup.
Ok, et comment est-ce que vous avez vécu ou suivi l'entrée en bourse de Game Workshop en 1994? You know,
Yeah, of
I don't know
course.
the quote of the price.
I've watched, I followed it my whole life. I
Okay.
watched it
And what did
go
you
up,
feel?
and I saw it came down. And there was one moment when I was chairman of IDOS when the share price had gone right down because of the overstocks they had with the Lord of the Rings range. I was thinking maybe we should make an acquisition for the intellectual property and for a video games industry company like IDOS to own Games Workshop. And so we did discuss that. Don't think I've ever said that on camera before, but we did talk about it in the board meeting about whether it's a worthwhile proposition. But the rest of the board was so used to digital content as opposed to physical content that there wasn't much excitement for it. But the price, I think the market cap was around about 90 million at that time. Of course, these things, opportunities present themselves, but
Yes.
they don't always happen. No, I had shares in IDOS, I had shares in Sumo Group, which we sold to, I was chairman of Sumo Group, which we sold to Tencent last year for $1.3 billion. I own a tiny bit, by the way. It's a public company. But I've always invested in my new entities. I don't want to go back.
La prochaine question est: que pensez-vous de Game Workshop aujourd'hui? La société reflète-t-elle encore ce pourquoi vous l'avez créée?
It's a big question. Clearly, Games Workshop has changed phenomenally since we started it. I mean, it was a mail order company in a third floor flat in Shepherd's Bush, part-time hobby, nothing more. And of course, we were fortunate to get the distribution rights for Europe for Dungeons & Dragons, and we published our own board games, White Dwarf magazine, imported a lot more games from the USA, created our own games, and the business grew. And we eventually sold out in 1991. But in that period, we'd built a business that was totally self-centered in its ability to operate. We created our own games, we sold them through our own shops, we promoted through our own magazine, we had our own miniatures, and we had staff who were not traditional staff. We employed gamers. So we had our own ecosystem. And today, Games Workshop is still relatively the same. What it has done is focused on the key elements of the business, which was Warhammer 40k, Citadel Miniatures, and White Dwarf magazine, which is really what we did then, but they've just done it at scale because they've now got public capital to be able to build a much bigger business than ever we were able to do. Plus they have people in there who are probably way better than we would ever have been in what they do to build a big business. So it's phenomenal what Workshop has become, a £3 billion valued company on the London Stock Exchange. It's survived the test of time, which is great. But at the same time, it's had enormous cultural and social impact on the world. And why is that? Because when we enter this world, we learn through play. Play is natural. It's how we express ourselves, how we learn. And both role-playing games and board games and video games, I would argue, are a contextual hub for learning. You problem solve, you learn intuitively, you're not punished for making a mistake like you are in an examination, you collaborate, you enjoy social activities together, you create stories, they're very creative in many ways, and in video games, children can learn when playing Minecraft that by applying the heat of a furnace to silica sand, they make glass and they take that glass and they put it in their environments. It's learning by doing. And the problem solving when you're playing games and the strategies required are all also kind of good meta skills for life. So games are a fun way of learning without realizing you're learning. And all the simulations that are created, again, are effectively business simulations, which in a strict learning environment like school or university can often be dull and boring. But if you contextualize them within a game, it's enjoyable. So why can't fun be applied to learning? It just seems crazy that we don't use more games-based learning in all ways of all educational institutions. So I think Games Workshop has been part of that, bringing games into a public eye in a much more positive way, both culturally, socially, and of course economically.
Si vous deviez à nouveau faire Game Workshop, mais de nos jours, à quoi ressemblerait-il et comment est-ce que vous feriez?
That's a funny question. When you're young and you have a lot of energy, drive, determination, and you don't mind adversity, you're happy to smile through adversity because you're doing what you believe in. You're driven by passion. So today, I'm not too sure if I'll be able to live in a van for 3 months. But I'll be much better at talking to a bank manager because I've become prepared. When we started Games Workshop, we were totally unprepared, but all we had was our enthusiasm. You go to the bank manager and say, I've got this great game. It's a role-playing game. You kill monsters and find treasure and go, these fantastic gears of the mind. And you can be a wizard or a hero or a cleric, and it's amazing. It goes on for weeks. And he looks at you like a dog watching television. He's had heads all over the place and asks you to leave. And so whilst we were angry at the time, now I understand that we were not ready to get investment from the bank manager. We had no supporting documentation, no cash flows, no investment memorandum, nothing other than our enthusiasm. So today I'd be much better armed. I'd also seek finance, get some capital into the company to give me the runway to execute on the plan, to get that right people in to help us execute on the plan. So I do it a lot more professionally. Would I do it better? Who knows?
À l'heure de la dématérialisation, est-ce que le hobby peut devenir une forme de contre-courant?
Of course it's important to have physical games. One should not be at the expense of the other. They should be additive to make the opportunity in the market even bigger than they are in isolation. So I mean, it's the same as would Hollywood be challenged by YouTube? No, they live side by side and you can enjoy both. So some people play only video games, some people play only physical games, whether it's Warhammer or board games like I do. And a lot of people play both. Its play is universal and it can be enjoyed in many formats, and I don't think there are many people who want to get rid of anything part of that games industry. We should all one big happy playful family. You spend time doing what you enjoy. Some people play golf all week. Some people have model railways and buy small bits to add to that model railway. We all have our hobbies, and if you get really into your hobby, you dedicate more and more time to it. And it's not an addiction in the sense that you can't get away from it, but you enjoy doing it, so why not indulge yourself over as much time as you want to dedicate to it? But well, even in board games now, you can play on BoardGameArena.com and have a Zoom window open, which we did during lockdown. We had a Zoom window so we could talk trash to each other and do deals and stab people in the back and like, ha. At the same time, I'm playing with the convenience of Board Game Arena because it does all the computation for you and the record keeping. So I can see why people do it. But to your point, there's nothing better than sitting around a table, enjoying the social fun and having games, not just to enjoy, but to be kind of just a bit of social context for having fun and enjoying other people's company.
Avez-vous le sentiment d'avoir été à l'origine de la passion de nombreuses personnes pour les jeux de figurines? Qu'est-ce que cela vous procure comme sentiment?
Well, I'm aware that it's had a big effect on a lot of people, but how big, I've no idea. I know if I post something on Twitter, I get a lot of Twitter love back, and your friend recently announced that Forest of Doom had just had its 40th anniversary, and I was just absolutely staggered and humbled by the number of people who wrote saying what an important effect it had on their lives, how it saved them from dark moments in their life, how it encouraged them to be creative and made them the people they are today. And that is incredibly gratifying. And when I travel abroad, I meet people who say similar things, and which is great because they were Fighting Fantasy was published in 25 languages, and of course Games Workshop was a huge influence on people's growing up in their formative years. You know, when I meet people in town, you know, in proper jobs and grown-ups and saying, and they kind of suddenly say, are you the Ian Livingstone from Games Workshop? Are you the Ian Livingstone from Fighting Fantasy? Yes, I am. And they go into kind of childlike mode of their imaginations going, zooming back in time for that moment when something impacted on their brains and went, wow. And I find it quite staggering that it had such an impact on people, because you didn't realize at the time because you were very young, but it's only now that you come to realize just how much effect we had on people's lives, and that's just amazing.
Il nous reste que 2 questions à voir, et c'est un petit hommage aussi à Thinkerview, puisqu'ils ont coutume de poser ce genre de questions en fin d'interview. Avez-vous de 1 à 3 livres à conseiller qui vous ont fait vibrer ou grandir? Ici, en l'occurrence, ça peut être des livres ou des jeux.
Well, the things that influenced me was Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's epic had a big influence on me, of course, that worlds of wonder that had never been described in such wonderful detail and atmospheric detail before. I was a huge science fiction reader, and my favourite author was probably Philip K. Dick. And then I played endless hours of Dungeons and Dragons. So all those helped to formulate my ideas of what entertainment in the fantasy world should be. Yeah, those are the 3.
It's the last question. Do you have any advice for future generation?
The best thing I could say for anyone, if they're thinking about their careers, is not necessarily think about what qualifications they have, but to think what they want to do personally. If you can follow your heart, you should try and do that. And if you fail, it doesn't matter. Failure is just success, work in progress. Keep going, and don't do it for money. Do it for the right reason. If you're successful, the money will follow. But don't set out, I'm going to be a millionaire. Set out, I want to do this. And for me, it was, I want to make games, with no assumptions of whether it's going to be successful. You just want to do it. And partner with somebody who are able to do the things that you can't do or shouldn't be doing. And enjoy what you do, or do something else. No, it's a state school.
State school, yeah.
So I funded it to get it approved. So it was a £38 million capital project, but paid by the government. But it's focused on digital making, digital creativity, a good arts education, because I think arts is often seen as a nice to have, and I think it's essential. You know, the world's greatest polymath, Leonardo da Vinci, was also an engineer and a mathematician, as well as being a rather good painter. And so you need to join the left side and the right side of your brain. They also encourage collaboration, project-based work, problem-based work, trying to contextualize learning. Knowledge is important, but I also think know-how is equally important. Qualifications are important, but I think skills are equally important. So it's trying to get children work-ready and world-ready, to have an entrepreneurial mindset, to understand that failure is okay because you can learn from your mistakes. Give them the right digital making tools or the right skills to be able to operate in a world that's being transformed by technology, and hopefully they might become a job maker rather than just a job seeker. Well, I want the Livingstone Academy Bournemouth to be a flagship for new ways of learning. The broadcast model has survived too long, and it does not fit with Generation Z. Everything they do is interactive. They want agency of control in learning. They want to be involved fundamentally in their learning, not just being told stuff. They've got these things called iPhones that has got as much knowledge as you want to be successful in any quiz night. So it's the application of knowledge that's important, and that's often being missed at school. So they're testing to memory. So recalling knowledge is a waste of time. And there's no point in training kids like robots, because they won't be able to compete with the real thing. So any job that involves repetition is going to be replaced by robots or artificial intelligence. So the only thing we have is our creativity and ability to think. So we need to promote that. So we have to have creativity, gives diverse thinking, and application of design in everything we do is so fundamentally important. So the good arts education, collaboration, because we're all different, we're all good at some things and bad at other things. There's no point in having a standardized metric with an examination to test people and say you're good at this and bad at that, because that fear of failure early on is just pointless. But together, being different, we can do great things, and that emulates the workplace. So let's get away from this siloed subjects, siloed learning, and get everything much more collaborative, and hopefully they might not only enjoy that learning, it might make them much more able to succeed in a world that's changing on a daily basis. Yeah.
That's
Well,
right.
Fighting Fantasy, you know, they were criticized so much at the time, and yet they got a whole generation of children reading. They were great for reluctant readers. They were great for literacy, great for critical thinking. All the parents say, "Oh, my child didn't read," until they read your books. And yet the media was saying these aren't real books, they're not proper books, because they're game books. Hello, they're getting children reading, what's your problem?
Voilà les amis, l'interview de Sir Ian Livingstone est maintenant terminée. Un grand merci à Arkham Asylum déjà d'avoir traduit en français d'Iceman. Il y a un lien en description si vous voulez tout simplement le précommander ou l'acheter. Celui-ci sera disponible dans toutes les boutiques spécialisées, c'est-à-dire celles qui touchent au jeu à partir de fin juin. Et le livre sera distribué après dans la grande distribution habituelle des librairies plus tard dans l'année. Un grand merci à vous Sir Ian Livingstone aussi pour votre temps et pour votre accueil.
A plus, la Wargammer.